the year was drawing to a close, and the earth itself seemed to fall silent. Across medieval Europe, the first snow drifted gently from a gray sky, covering the brown fields that had once promised harvests. The air was heavy, cold, and still. For the peasants who worked the land, winter was not a season of beauty. It was a season of trial. Huts of wood and thatch stood huddled together, their chimneys sending thin streams of smoke into the frozen air. Inside, families pressed close to the fire, their faces dimly lit by flickering flames. The harvest had already been stored away, but for many it was never enough. Failed crops, poor soil, or unexpected rains had left granaries half empty. The people knew what that meant. The winter ahead would be hard. The shadow of hunger winter was always feared. For peasants, life depended on what the earth gave in spring and summer. If those seasons had been kind, there might be grain in the bins, salted meat in the storeroom, and dried beans hanging in bundles. But when the land failed, hunger followed. The first snowflakes carried more than cold. They carried a silent question. Would we endure? As the days shortened and the nights grew longer, families looked at their stores of food. Mothers counted loaves of coarse bread. Fathers examined barrels of salted fish. Some sighed in relief, others felt dread, knowing the stores would not last. Children watched with wide eyes, too young to understand, yet sensing the worry in every adult glance. The village falls quiet. The rhythm of life slowed. The fields, once alive with farmers, lay bare and frozen. The marketplace, once filled with noisy trade, grew still. Roads became dangerous, covered with snow and ice, cutting villages off from one another. Silence spread across the land, broken only by the crackle of firewood or the howl of the wind. Even animals grew quiet, their breath steaming in the frosty air. The stillness was eerie, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A season of preparation, yet peasants were no strangers to winter. Generations had taught them to prepare in every way possible. Herbs were hung in kitchens, not only to flavor the little food that remained, but also as medicine. Bundles of firewood were stacked high, for warmth was as precious as bread. Every family looked to the coming weeks with a mixture of caution and faith. Survival was not guaranteed, but hope was stitched into the fabric of daily life. The first long night. When the first long night settled over the land, families gathered around the hearth. Shadows danced on the walls, and the only sound was the whisper of the fire. Stories were told, prayers were spoken, and hands were clasped tightly together. Outside, the snow fell steadily, soft yet merciless. The land was entering its hardest season, and so were the people. Winter had arrived, and with it, the great test of endurance for the peasants who lived in its grip. Closing of Block 1. Thus begins the story of survival. The first snow is not only a sign of beauty, but a herald of hardship. For medieval peasants, every winter was a battle against hunger, cold, and despair. Their journey through the season would demand resilience, sacrifice, and a faith stronger than the frost that surrounded them. The snow that blanketed the earth was beautiful from afar, yet for the peasants, beauty could not hide the truth. Beneath that white sheet lay fields that had failed them. Once they had been seas of golden wheat and green barley, swaying in the summer sun. Now they were only frozen memories, cold and empty. The fragile harvest in medieval times, the harvest was everything. From spring sowing to summer growth and autumn gathering, the rhythm of life depended on the soil. Yet the soil was fragile. easily broken by too much rain, too little sun, or the endless burden of overuse. One year might bring abundance, the next only despair. Crops rotted in wet summers or shriveled under drought. Sometimes disease spread among plants, destroying entire fields. When autumn arrived without full granaries, the shadow of famine stretched long into the coming winter. The burdened peasants knew the land better than anyone. They walked its furrows barefoot, planted seeds with their hands, and bent their backs beneath the sun. To see the earth give nothing in return was more than disappointment. It was heartbreak. A failed harvest meant more than hunger. It meant debts to the Lord could not be paid. It meant animals might be sold, tools pawned, and children sent to beg. It meant choices that no parent wished to make. The silence of the fields as winter settled. Peasants often walked to the edge of their land, staring at the snow-covered emptiness. They remembered the effort of sowing, the hopes carried with each seed, and the prayers whispered as the sky gave rain or sun. Now, only silence remained. The fields were mute, yet they seemed to echo with loss. Each frozen furrow was a reminder that life itself hung by a thread spun by the soil. The dependence on nature. In modern times, food can travel across oceans. But for medieval peasants, the land beneath their feet was the only source of life. When it failed, nothing could replace it. No market was full when every village suffered. No granary was rich when every harvest was poor. Nature was both friend and foe. It gave freely in one season and withheld cruelly in another. Peasants prayed to saints, offered gifts to churches, and clung to hope. But deep down they knew the earth decided their fate. Hunger's early whispers, it began slowly. A smaller loaf of bread at dinner, a thinner broth simmering in the pot, children asking for more and being told to wait until tomorrow. Hunger did not roar immediately. It whispered first, soft but steady, reminding every stomach that the fields were bare. The people looked to their lords, but the castles held their own stores. Nobles feasted while villages tightened belts. The contrast was bitter, but peasants had no choice. The empty fields gave them nothing. Closing of Block 2 thus, the winter deepened not only in cold, but in spirit. The peasants saw their empty fields and felt the weight of despair. The soil that had once promised life now gave them silence. And so, the famine year truly began, with the haunting vision of land that could not feed its people. The sun still rose each morning, pale and distant. But for medieval peasants living through a famine winter, days blended into nights. Survival was no longer about thriving, it was about enduring hour by hour. A meal of almost nothing breakfast, if it could be called that, was often only a small piece of coarse bread. The flour was not always made of pure grain. In desperate years, peasants mixed whatever they could find, ground beans, acorns, even powdered bark, stretching a handful of wheat into a loaf that filled the stomach more than it nourished it. The broth that simmered in the pot was thin, flavored with little more than water and perhaps a few root vegetables that had survived the frost. Meat was rare, often reserved for festival days or entirely absent in famine years. A piece of cheese, a scrap of salted fish, or a handful of peas could be a family's treasure. For children, hunger was the constant companion. Their ribs showed beneath their clothes, and their eyes followed every crumb that fell from the table. Parents often gave their own share away, whispering to their children to eat slowly, as though stretching the moment could stretch the meal. The endless cold food was not the only enemy. Cold pressed into every corner of their wooden huts. Fires were precious, but firewood was limited. Families huddled together, wrapping themselves in wool blankets if they had them, or rough straw if they did not. The cold seeped into bones, making hands stiff and feet numb. Every task became harder, fetching water from a frozen stream, cutting wood with trembling fingers, or even kneading dough in the bitter air. Work without strength peasants still had duties, no matter their hunger. Animals needed tending. The Lord demanded rents even in lean years. Snow had to be cleared, roofs mended, and broken tools repaired, yet hunger robbed people of strength. Men staggered under loads they once carried with ease. Women grew faint as they worked in the fields or kitchens. Children weakened, could no longer play, their laughter replaced by quiet fatigue. Still, the work continued, because to stop was to invite death. The silent toll hunger changes not only the body but the mind. Patience thinned like the soup in their pots. Arguments grew in cottages as mothers worried about tomorrow and fathers struggled with despair. Some peasants grew bitter, blaming their lords or even God himself. Others fell into silence, accepting their suffering as fate. Between despair and hope lay only endurance, the stubborn will to survive, the sound of survival. And yet, even in the struggle, life went on. The creak of wooden doors, the crunch of boots on snow, the whistle of wind across frozen fields, all became the background music of survival. Children clutched dolls made of rags, women hummed lullabies by the fire, and men sharpened tools with slow determination. In these small moments, there was defiance, a refusal to let famine strip them of all humanity. Closing of Block 3. The struggle of daily life was not dramatic, not always filled with riots or grand gestures. It was a quiet, grinding battle against hunger, cold, and despair. Each loaf of bread, each stick of wood, and each shared smile was an act of resistance. For peasants in a famine year, life was not about living well. It was about living at all. The village, once alive with chatter and the rhythm of daily work, now lay wrapped in an unnatural quiet. Winter had silenced not only the fields but also the hearts of the people. Where once children ran along muddy lanes, their laughter carrying through the air, now only the crunch of snow under cautious footsteps remained. Empty lanes. The dirt roads that wound between cottages were covered in thick ice. Carts no longer rattled past, for there was little to sell, little to buy. Market days came and went, but the square was nearly bare. Traders stayed home, knowing there was no grain to offer, no coins to collect. Doors stayed shut, shutters drawn against the biting wind. Smoke rose from chimneys, thin and weak, a sign that families were conserving their wood. The absence of song in better years, winter was not only hardship. Villagers gathered to sing songs, tell tales, and hold small festivals to lighten the season's burden. But in a famine year, music died.
Songs were too heavy for hungry throats, laughter too costly when bellies ached. The silence was more than the absence of sound.
It was the presence of despair, pressing against every wall. The hollow church bells. Even the church, the heart of many villages, fell quieter. Bells still rang on Sundays, but their sound echoed strangely in the cold air. Fewer came to service, for the weak could not walk through the snow. Those who did arrive prayed longer, their voices trembling as though the heavens might be convinced to send relief. Candles burned low before statues of saints, wax dripping like tears. Faith remained, but it was tested by every empty stomach and every buried child. Shadows of desperation. In the silence, whispers grew. Families spoke in hushed tones about stealing food, about sneaking into the Lord's granaries, about fleeing the village altogether. Desperation lived in every shadow, though most still clung to endurance. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, carrying the weight of hunger and fear, nature's harsh music. When sound did break the silence, it was nature's own harsh song. The wind howled across the frozen fields, rattling shutters and whistling through gaps in wooden walls. Wolves prowled at the edge of the forest, their cries carrying into the night, reminding peasants that even predators were hungry. To lie awake at night and hear the distant howl of wolves was to know that all creatures shared the same struggle: survival. Closing of Block 4. The village had not been abandoned, but it felt ghostly. The living moved slowly, as if their spirits were half asleep, waiting for spring to wake them. In famine winters, silence itself became a companion, one that wrapped the village in a shroud of sorrow. Where there had once been the pulse of life, now there was only the quiet rhythm of endurance. At first, hunger came quietly like a thief in the night. It did not arrive with sudden emptiness, but with slow reductions. A smaller portion at supper, an extra day before baking bread, a thinner broth ladled into wooden bowls. Families thought they were stretching their food. In truth, hunger was stretching its shadow across their lives. Rationing begins. Every household became its own treasury, guarded with care. Mothers counted loaves of bread, fathers measured grain, children were warned not to ask for more. The smallest mistake, a careless handful of oats, a slice too thick, could cost the family precious days of survival. Clay jars that once brimmed with beans or peas now revealed their bottoms sooner than expected. Families learned to eat less, to chew slowly, to trick their stomachs with hot water or herbs. The stomach's protest children felt it first. Their thin bodies demanded growth, yet their bowls offered little. They asked, "Is there more?" But the answer was always silence or a gentle "tomorrow." Adults bore their hunger with gritted teeth, swallowing pain behind tired smiles. They knew weakness could not show. Work still needed doing. Firewood still needed chopping. Yet the stomach's protest was relentless, growling in the night, refusing to be ignored. The emotional weight hunger was more than physical. It gnawed at the mind. Sleep became restless, dreams filled with visions of feasts, bread ovens steaming, tables laden with meat, fields heavy with wheat. To wake from such dreams was to feel despair twice over, once in the empty stomach, and again in the empty world outside. Small acts of sacrifice, parents often gave their portions to children, claiming they had already eaten. Elderly members quietly stepped aside, taking less so that the young might endure. These sacrifices were rarely spoken, but everyone knew. The love within families became both shield and wound, protecting one life at the cost of another. The slow weakness, hunger weakened bodies. Tasks once simple became difficult. A short walk left men breathless. Women's hands trembled as they kneaded dough. Even laughter, once bright and free, now carried a thin, weary sound. It was not yet starvation, but the path had begun. Closing of Block 5, the first signs of hunger were subtle, yet unmistakable. A smaller meal, a growling stomach, a weary step. The famine had entered not with noise, but with silence, embedding itself into every household. The peasants knew this was only the beginning. Winter was long and hunger was patient. In a famine winter, every crumb was precious. To waste food was unthinkable. To preserve it was an art, passed down through generations. Medieval peasants, though poor, carried the wisdom of countless winters, using simple yet ingenious methods to keep their food from spoiling. Salt. The white treasure salt was more valuable than gold in the peasants' eyes. It dried the juices of meat, protecting it from decay. A joint of pork or a side of fish, when rubbed with salt, could last weeks or even months. Families treated salted food as wealth, guarding it as carefully as coins, but salt was not always easy to come by. Villages far from coasts or salt mines struggled to afford it. When famine struck, even a pinch of salt could mean survival, or sickness from spoiled food. Smoking and drying peasants often hung strips of meat above their hearths, letting smoke seep deep into the flesh. The smoky air that warmed their cottages also kept meat edible longer, though the flavor was bitter. Vegetables and herbs, too, were dried. Beans, peas, and even apples could be strung on threads, hung in kitchens where the fire's warmth slowly removed their moisture. In winter, a handful of dried beans boiled in water might become the only meal of the day. Hidden storage food was kept in clever places. Grain might be sealed in clay pots and buried in the ground, safe from rats and damp. Roots were stored in cellars, covered with straw. Cheese was wrapped in cloth and hung from rafters, out of reach of hungry pests. Sometimes food was even hidden from neighbors. In times of famine, trust could be strained, and families guarded their stores in secret, knowing others might come begging or stealing, brewing and fermenting and in famine. Brewing ale or fermenting cabbage into sour flavors like sauerkraut had purpose. These foods lasted longer than their fresh forms and gave strength during the darkest days. The tang of fermented food was sharp, but it reminded peasants of endurance. The constant fear of spoilage despite all efforts, food spoiled. Mice chewed through sacks. Damp air rotted grain. Jars cracked in the frost. When a family opened their last pot of beans only to find mold, the despair was as heavy as death itself. Every preserved meal was a gamble against time and nature. Closing of Block 6 preserving food was not only a practice, it was a prayer. Each strip of smoked meat, each jar of dried beans was a promise of tomorrow. For peasants, these humble stores represented not just survival, but hope. And in famine years, hope itself was a kind of nourishment. To sit at a peasant's table during a famine year was to witness the art of making something out of nothing. These were not feasts, not even proper meals, but desperate creations meant only to keep the body alive. Bread of desperation. Bread was the heart of the medieval diet. But in famine winters, true grain bread became rare. Wheat and rye were too precious to use in their pure form. Instead, peasants mixed what little flour they had with substitutes: ground beans, peas, chestnuts, or even the inner bark of trees. This famine bread was dark, coarse, and bitter. It filled the stomach, but it weakened the body, for it offered little nutrition. Yet when children chewed on its hard crust, it was a gift of life. Thin broths and soups, large cauldrons once filled with hearty stews of vegetables and meat were now reduced to thin broths. Into the pot went whatever could be found. A few carrots, a handful of peas, a bone boiled until all flavor was gone. The broth was stretched with water, and each family member received a small bowl. Hot liquid warmed the body, even if it offered little food. Sometimes herbs were added, not for taste, but for the belief they carried healing strength. Strange substitutes. Hunger pushed peasants to eat what was never meant to be food. Weeds gathered from frozen fields were boiled into bitter greens. Acorns, usually animal feed, were ground into flour. Even sawdust was sometimes mixed into bread to make it last. Children made faces at the strange meals, but parents urged them to eat. In famine, there was no room for choice. Rare delicacies, on rare days, when luck favored them, peasants might snare a rabbit, catch a fish beneath the ice, or share a little milk from a goat. These moments were celebrated like festivals. A single egg cracked into the pot could brighten the spirits of an entire family. Such food was precious, not only for nourishment, but for the reminder that joy was still possible. Hunger as seasoning. What little food they had was often bland. Salt was scarce, spices a distant dream. Yet hunger itself was a cruel seasoning, making even the bitterest meals taste acceptable. When stomachs ached, peasants learned to swallow anything: Closing of Block 7. The poor man's meal was not about flavor, nor about satisfaction. It was about survival. Each bowl of thin soup, each crust of bark bread, was a silent victory over famine. For medieval peasants, these meals told a story, that life, no matter how reduced, was still worth clinging to. Hunger is heavy when carried alone. But in medieval villages, survival was rarely the struggle of one family. It was the burden of all. In famine winters, peasants turned to one another, knowing that unity was their greatest weapon against despair. Shared fires when firewood ran low, neighbors gathered under one roof. Families huddled together around a single hearth, sharing not only heat but also company. The warmth of a crowded cottage was more than physical. It gave courage. In the dim light of fire, stories were told, songs whispered, and silence shared without shame. The fire burned brighter when more than one family fed it. Food divided, food multiplied. Though food was scarce, many believed it was better to share than to hoard. A loaf of bread cut into more pieces seemed to stretch farther than when eaten by only a few. Soups grew thinner, but the spirit grew stronger when everyone dipped their spoons from the same pot. In this way, hunger was not erased, but it was softened. Children learned that even in the hardest times, kindness still mattered. Collective labor snow buried paths, froze wells, and blocked roads. Alone, one family could not clear it all. Together, villagers shoveled, chopped wood, repaired roofs, and carried water. Hunger made bodies weak, but many hands turned weakness into strength. The work itself was a rhythm, a reminder that they were not abandoned. Comfort in ceremony. The church became more than a place of prayer. It was a gathering hall, a refuge. Villagers met to light candles, sing hymns, and exchange words of encouragement. Even when faith wavered, the act of coming together gave shape to hope. Ceremony became survival. Watching over one. Another, when illness spread, neighbors tended to the sick. When a family lost everything, others gave what little they could spare. Sometimes it was only a blanket, a handful of beans, or a place by the fire. But these small acts created invisible threads of strength that held the village together. To survive alone was nearly impossible. To survive together was hard, but possible. Closing of Block 8, the power of community did not fill stomachs or banish the cold completely. But it gave peasants the will to continue, and in famine years, willpower was as vital as bread. Hunger was heavy, yes, but when lifted by many, it could be borne a little longer. When storerooms thinned and rations grew smaller, peasants turned to the land itself, hoping it might still offer hidden gifts. Winter's grip was merciless, but even in snow, the earth sometimes whispered secrets of survival. Foraging was not guaranteed to succeed, but it was often the difference between life and death. Searching beneath the frost with crude tools or bare hands, villagers dug beneath the frozen ground, searching for roots left behind. Turnips, carrots, and parsnips sometimes survived hidden under layers of earth. Even the smallest root, shriveled and cold, became treasure when pulled from the soil. Children learned to spot the signs: a patch where snow had melted thin, a place where the earth looked disturbed. They scratched the ground with numb fingers, hoping for food. The forest's forests became both friend and foe. Beneath snow-covered branches, peasants searched for berries left from autumn, nuts overlooked by animals, or mushrooms clinging stubbornly to tree trunks. Herbs were gathered not for meals, but for teas believed to warm the body or ease hunger's ache. Bitter though they were, they gave comfort when boiled into hot water, but forests held danger as well. Wolves prowled, and the cold itself could swallow a wanderer who strayed too far. Fishing beneath the ice for those near rivers, Peasants cut holes through the ice, lowering lines or nets in hopes of catching fish. The effort was exhausting, the results uncertain, but a single fish could feed a family for a day. The splash of water beneath the frozen surface was a reminder that life still moved, even when the world above seemed dead. Small hunt traps were set for rabbits, squirrels, or birds. A snared animal was cause for celebration, though often the bones yielded as much as the flesh. Everything was boiled, nothing wasted. Fur, fat, skin, and marrow were used in some way. Hunger erased the luxury of choice. Any creature caught became food. The risk of desperation foraging demanded strength, but hunger stole energy. Many stumbled back to their huts with empty hands, weaker than when they left. Some did not return at all, lost to cold or exhaustion, yet still they went. For in famine winters, hope was often hidden in the snow, waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to search. Closing of Block 9 foraging in the snow was not abundance. It was survival at its barest. A handful of nuts, a single rabbit, or a root dug from frozen earth meant one more day of life. And in famine winters, one more day could make all the difference. In a famine winter, when fields were barren and stores were thin, peasants turned to their most faithful companions, their animals. Livestock were more than property. They were lifelines, moving bundles of warmth and nourishment that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Chickens, keepers of the egg even in the coldest months. A few hardy hens still laid eggs. An egg was a miracle, small, fragile, yet filled with life and strength. Mothers often cracked one into thin broth to thicken it, or boiled it to divide among children. The sound of a hen clucking in the yard was comfort itself, for it meant hope still lingered. Goats. Milk for the poor cows required much fodder, but goats survived on less. Their milk, though thin, became cheese and butter, lasting longer than fresh milk could. A little goat's cheese, hard and salty, was treasure enough to last through many days. Families treated goats with tender care, often bringing them into huts at night for warmth. The bond between peasant and goat was one of shared survival. Pigs. The promise of meat pigs were raised with a grim truth. Eventually, they would be slaughtered. Their meat was salted, smoked, and stored for the hardest months. Even the bones were boiled, the fat rendered into lard, and the skin used for clothing or tools. The life of a pig was both a companion's presence and a family's security. Cows, a wealth few owned, not every peasant owned a cow. Those who did were considered fortunate. Cows gave milk, dung for fuel, and calves for the future. In famine years, their value was beyond measure. Yet keeping a cow alive through winter was a challenge, for hay was scarce. Many peasants faced the heartbreaking choice of slaughtering an animal early, gaining short-term meat but losing long-term survival. Horses and donkeys. These animals were not food, but labor. They pulled carts, carried firewood, and broke ice for water. Without them, villages slowed to a crawl. To feed a horse was costly, but to lose one was devastating. Companions and suffering animals, too, suffered in famine winters. They grew thin, their ribs showing like their masters. Their eyes reflected the same quiet desperation, yet their presence gave peasants strength, not only in their milk and meat, but in their company. A cow's steady breath in the cold, a goat's bleat in the night, a dog lying close to the fire. These were small reminders that life continued, fragile but stubborn. Closing of Block 10 livestock were more than animals in famine years. They were family, wealth, food, and faith. Every egg, every drop of milk, every scrap of meat was a gift. For peasants, to keep their animals alive was to keep themselves alive. And so the bond between man and beast deepened, woven from necessity and nurtured by survival. When the stomach ached and the fields gave nothing, peasants lifted their eyes not to the earth but to the heavens. Hunger weakened their bodies, but faith gave them strength to endure. In famine winters, prayers became as necessary as bread, the church as refuge. The village church stood at the center, its stone walls stronger than any hut. Even when snow piled high against its doors, peasants gathered there. They came not with food, but with hope. Candles flickered before wooden altars, their flames trembling in the draught. Each flame was a symbol, a family's prayer for one more day, one more meal, one more spring. Collective prayer on Sundays, voices rose together, weary yet sincere. The priest spoke of trials, of how suffering on earth was not punishment but a test. He urged the people to endure as Christ had endured. Villagers knelt, their knees pressed against the cold stone floor. They prayed aloud for their children, for their animals, for their neighbors. The sound of so many voices filled the church like a river, flowing upward toward unseen skies. Saints and intercession-specific saints were invoked in times of famine. Saint Nicholas, patron of the poor. Saint Isidore, patron of farmers. Saint Bridget, whose legend spoke of endless food. Peasants whispered their names, believing these holy figures might intercede, carrying human pleas to God's ears. Small offerings were placed on the altar, not gold or jewels, but tokens of love. A loaf of bread, a carved figure, a handful of herbs, private prayers. In cottages, families prayed before sleeping. Parents traced crosses on their children's foreheads, asking for protection through the night. A mother stirring thin broth murmured blessings, hoping the food would stretch far enough. Faith became woven into every action. To plant, to cook, to gather wood, each task was paired with whispered words to heaven. The comfort of ritual prayer was not only about divine help, it was about rhythm, about order in a world that seemed chaotic. Ritual gave peasants a sense of control, a way to push back against despair. Lighting a candle, crossing oneself, kneeling in silence. These were small acts, but together they built a wall against hopelessness. Closing of Block 11 prayers did not fill bellies or warm cold nights, yet they gave something just as vital: strength. Faith turned hunger into endurance, despair into patience. In famine winters, survival was not only of the body, it was of the spirit, and for the peasants, prayer kept that spirit alive. When food was scarce and prayers seemed unanswered, peasants turned to the unseen world for explanations. In famine winters, hunger was not only a physical trial, it was a mystery that needed meaning. Superstitions and omens gave peasants a way to understand the incomprehensible. Signs in the sky, the winter sky was often watched with fearful eyes. A red sunset was thought to signal storms. A halo around the moon meant hunger would deepen. Shooting stars were whispers from heaven. Some said they were warnings, others believed them to be souls of the dead, restless because of earthly suffering. Even the way the wind howled through the village was taken as a message. Its pitch said to foretell sickness or death. Animals as messengers, animals too became signs. If crows gathered on a rooftop, it meant famine would claim another family. Owls calling at night were seen as omens of death. A sudden silence of birds was more frightening than their cries, for it suggested even nature held its breath. Livestock behavior was studied closely. A restless cow or a hen refusing to lay eggs might mean evil spirits were near, curses and witches. When hunger pressed hardest, suspicion grew. Some peasants whispered that famine was not natural at all, but caused by curses or witches in the village. An old woman living alone, a neighbor with too much food, or someone whose animals thrived while others starved. All could become targets of blame. Fear fed superstition. and superstition fed fear. Dreams as warnings dreams were taken seriously. A dream of full tables and warm bread might mean relief was near. A dream of barren trees or dead animals was a warning. Children's dreams were considered especially powerful, for their innocence was believed to carry truth. Mothers listened carefully when their children spoke of visions in the night. Rituals for protection. To fight these unseen forces, peasants turned to rituals. Garlic hung above doors, holy water sprinkled on barns, charms carved into wooden beams. Ashes from the hearth were spread in fields to drive away evil. Even small gestures, like crossing oneself before opening a food jar, became protective acts against famine's unseen hand. Closing of Block 12 superstitions and omens could not create food, but they gave peasants a framework of understanding. In a world where famine seemed senseless, these beliefs offered meaning. However fearful, for the medieval peasant, survival was not just a battle against hunger, but against the invisible forces they believed shaped their fate. Even in the harshest famine winters, peasants clung to their traditions. Festivals were not only about food and feasting, they were about hope, memory, and the need to remind themselves that joy was still possible. Poverty did not erase celebration. It reshaped it. A festival without feast. Normally, winter festivals marked moments of light in the darkest season. Tables would be set with bread, roasted meats, and mugs of ale. But in famine years, the feast was only symbolic. A single loaf might be shared by dozens. A pot of broth, watery and thin, became the centerpiece of a gathering. The food was little, but the act of eating together gave warmth greater than fire. The role of ritual, the church calendar still marked holy days. Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, all were observed even if their celebration was quiet. Peasants gathered for midnight mass, walking through snow with lanterns in hand. Hymns rose into the cold air, voices trembling but strong. The rituals gave a rhythm to suffering, reminding the people that time was still moving forward, carrying them closer to spring. Music without instruments in better years. Fiddles, flutes, and drums echoed in villages. In famine years, the instruments were silent, yet songs remained. Families hummed old melodies by the fire, teaching children verses passed down through generations. A song cost nothing, yet it gave more than bread. It gave courage. The gift of light candles were precious in dark winters, but peasants saved scraps of wax to make small flames for festivals. A single candle burning in a cottage window was a beacon, a silent message to neighbors. We are still here. We still have hope. Light, however small, pushed back the endless dark. Symbolic gestures. Sometimes, festivals carried more symbolism than substance. A loaf of bread shaped into a cross, a handful of herbs tied with string and hung above a doorway. Even when no feast could be held, these gestures reminded peasants of continuity, that their ancestors had endured, and so would they. Closing of Block 13 winter festivals in poverty were not about abundance, but about resilience. They proved that even when hunger gnawed and despair loomed, peasants still found ways to create moments of meaning. Joy, however fragile, was itself a form of survival. When bellies were empty and nights stretched endlessly long, stories became nourishment for the spirit. Around the hearth, as the thin fire flickered and smoke curled toward the rafters, peasants told legends of hunger, tales shaped by generations, carried like seeds from one famine winter to the next. Tales of endless loaves. One story spoke of a saint who blessed a poor widow's oven. Though she had only a handful of flour, each time she baked, more bread appeared than before. Families whispered this tale as they kneaded their own dough, hoping that perhaps a miracle might fall upon their ovens too. The legend gave children comfort, even as they nibbled on bark-filled bread. Stories of the sleeping harvest, another tale told of fields that were not dead, but merely asleep. Beneath the snow, peasants imagined golden wheat waiting patiently for the warmth of spring. Parents spoke this legend to children at night. The harvest is only sleeping. One day it will wake and we will feast again. These words soothed frightened hearts, replacing despair with anticipation. The hungry spirits. Not all legends were hopeful. Some warned of restless spirits wandering the snowy fields, forever searching for food they had been denied in life. To hear the wind howl was to hear their cries. While frightening, such stories reminded peasants to remain grateful for every crust. For to waste food was to dishonor the dead. Animal myths, animals too, were woven into hunger tales. Foxes were said to guard secret caches of grain, stealing from barns only to bury food in hidden places. Birds were believed to carry prayers in their wings, flying to heaven to beg for spring's return. Children listened wide-eyed, imagining that perhaps a fox or a bird might lead them to salvation. The purpose of legends. These legends were more than entertainment. They gave shape to suffering. They reminded peasants that hunger was not endless, that they were part of a cycle larger than themselves. In famine winters, legends fed the mind when food could not feed the body. Closing of Block 14, the legends of hunger lived in every village, whispered from lips cracked by cold. They were gifts passed from the old to the young, carrying both warnings and hope. Though hunger hollowed their stomachs, stories filled their spirits. And sometimes spirit was the only thing keeping them alive. In famine winters, when food ran thin and despair pressed heavily, peasants lifted their hopes toward stories of saints and the mercy of God. Miracles, whether real or imagined, became lifelines for hungry hearts. Saints as protectors. Peasants often turned to saints as if they were neighbors who could intervene in times of crisis. Saint Nicholas was invoked as the protector of the poor, believed to bring hidden gifts in times of need. Saint Isidore the farmer was prayed to for blessings upon fields that lay barren. Saint Bridget was honored for her miracles of food, her legends telling of butter and milk that never ran out. Icons of these saints were touched with trembling fingers, kissed and placed near dwindling food stores, as though their presence might multiply what little remained. Miracles and stories. Villagers told of miraculous loaves of bread that never diminished, pots of stew that refilled themselves, or springs of water that burst forth in times of drought. Though few ever saw such wonders, the stories themselves gave life. For a child listening by the fire, a tale of a miraculous feast could be enough to quiet hunger pangs for a little while. Acts of mercy. The church, when able, offered alms of bread or grain. Wealthy monasteries opened their stores, distributing food to peasants who lined up in silence, bowls in hand. Though supplies were often small, the gesture itself was a reminder of mercy. To receive even a handful of barley was proof that kindness still lived in the world. Faith in divine justice. Many peasants believed famine was not the end, but a trial. They held that God tested his people, and those who endured would be rewarded. Others believed famine was punishment, urging repentance and prayer. Both views led peasants to kneel longer, sing louder, and cling to faith with all their remaining strength. The healing of spirit. Even when miracles did not come, the belief in them gave healing. Faith filled the space that food could not. It gave meaning to suffering, turning despair into endurance, and endurance into quiet dignity. Closing of Block 15. Saints, miracles, and mercy could not erase hunger, but they eased its weight. Through prayer and story, peasants found the strength to survive another day. And in famine winters, another day was itself a miracle. Hunger never traveled alone. Where famine settled, sickness followed. The body, robbed of its strength, could no longer fight even the smallest illness. In famine winters, peasants feared not only empty stomachs, but also the cough, the fever, and the quiet spreading of disease. Weakness in the body without proper food, muscles wasted. Faces grew hollow, arms and legs turned thin, and children looked like shadows of themselves. Cuts and scratches that once healed in days now festered for weeks. A simple chill could spiral into deadly sickness. The hungry body was not only weaker, it was slower, colder, and always vulnerable. The cough of winter, one of the most feared sounds, was the cough that broke the silence of cottages at night. A cough might be nothing, or it might be the beginning of an illness that would spread from bed to bed. Fires could warm the body, but not heal the sickness within. Herbs boiled into teas brought comfort, but rarely cure. In famine winters, every cough carried fear. The spread of disease hunger weakened resistance, and disease moved swiftly through crowded villages. Influenza, fevers, and infections claimed lives silently. Children and the elderly were the first to go, their bodies too fragile to endure both hunger and illness. Once one family was struck, neighbors soon followed. Shared huts, shared air, and shared suffering made the spread unstoppable. Remedies of the poor peasants turned to what they had. Garlic hung around necks, onion poultices pressed to skin, teas brewed from bitter herbs. Prayers and charms were spoken over the sick, crosses traced on their foreheads. Though little worked, these remedies gave families something precious, the feeling that they were not helpless. The weight of death in famine winters, death came quietly. A child stopped waking in the morning, an elder's breath faded in the night. The family had no choice but to bury their loved ones in frozen ground, the earth hard as stone. Graves dotted the edges of villages, silent markers of lives lost not only to hunger, but to the sickness it invited. Closing of Block 16, hunger was a cruel master, but disease was its darker servant. Together they stole strength, family, and hope. Yet even as graves filled, survivors pressed on, holding fast to whatever strength remained. For in famine winters, life itself became resistance. Winter's silence was not always empty. From the forest beyond the fields came the howls of wolves, their voices long and haunting in the night air. Just as peasants suffered hunger, so too did the beasts of the wild. And famine drove them closer, closer to the villages, until men, women, and children felt their presence pressing at their very doors. The echo of the howl at night. Families huddled in their cottages, listening. The wind roared through cracks, the fire crackled weakly, and then came the sound. A low, rising howl that began in the distance and rolled across the snow like thunder. Children pressed their faces into their mothers' arms, while fathers tightened their grip on wooden staffs or axes. The howl was more than a sound. It was a reminder that hunger prowled outside, as fierce as it did within. Wolves in the fields during famine winters. Wolves ventured boldly into open fields and sometimes into villages themselves. Tracks appeared in the snow outside barns, and animals went missing overnight. Chickens vanished, goats were found torn apart, and dogs that barked too long fell silent. Each sign was a warning. The wild had entered the world of men. The watch by night to protect what little livestock remained. Peasants took turns standing watch at night. Fires were kept burning at the edge of barns. Torches lit the village boundaries, and men carried crude weapons. The hunger in their bellies made them weak, but the hunger of wolves made them bold. It was a contest of endurance. Who would give in first, man or beast? Tales of danger stories spread of travelers dragged from roads, of children snatched while fetching water. Some stories were true, others grew in the telling, but all carried the same warning. In famine years, wolves were no longer creatures of the forest. They were predators at the very threshold of human life. Wolves as symbols to the peasants, wolves were more than animals. They became symbols of famine itself, relentless, merciless, and always hungry. Each howl reminded them that survival was a fragile thread, easily snapped by forces beyond their control. Closing of Block 17, the wolf at the door was not only a beast, but a fear that gnawed at every heart. Hunger lived inside the cottages, but it also prowled outside, pacing on 4 legs in the snow. For peasants in famine winters, survival meant guarding their food, their animals, and their lives against both hunger and the hungry world beyond. Hunger is a quiet torment, but there comes a point when silence breaks. In famine winters, the stomach itself became a rebel, pushing peasants beyond patience. Desperation drove them to acts they would never have imagined in times of plenty. Theft in the shadows at first. Rebellion was quiet, a stolen egg, a chicken taken from a neighbor's coop, a handful of grain lifted from the Lord's barn. These acts were whispered about but rarely confessed. The thief was not a criminal in the eyes of the village, but another victim of hunger. For who could blame a man who stole only to feed his starving child? Riots in the market. When famine spread beyond one village, entire regions trembled. Markets, once peaceful, became scenes of unrest. Crowds demanded bread from merchants who had none to sell. Stones were thrown, stalls overturned, and sometimes soldiers were called to restore order. The market square echoed with cries not of trade, but of desperation. "We are hungry! Give us bread!" Defiance against lords' peasants, bound by duty to their lords, carried heavy burdens even in famine years. Taxes and rents were still demanded, even when stores were empty. Some villages refused, their voices rising in defiance. Courage born of starvation led to rebellions, small uprisings that flared like sparks in the snow. Many were crushed, but the memory of resistance lingered. The cost of rebellion defiance was dangerous. Lords punished thieves harshly, branding them criminals. Soldiers crushed riots, leaving blood in the snow. Yet hunger was stronger than fear. For some, death by sword was no worse than death by starvation. The hunger's voice. The rebellion of the stomach was not only about bread, it was about dignity. To live as shadows while others feasted was unbearable. Hunger gave peasants a voice, one that spoke in riots, in theft, and in defiance. Closing of Block 18 in famine winters, hunger was more than an ache. It was a force, a rebel spirit that pushed peasants to fight, to steal, to rise. The rebellion of the stomach was not written in laws or decrees, but in every desperate act of survival. While peasants tightened belts and stretched their meager scraps into thin soups, life within the stone walls of castles told a different story. For nobles and lords, famine was a shadow glimpsed from a distance, not a storm endured. Their feasts continued, even as villages around them starved. The loaded tables, inside great halls, long wooden tables groaned beneath roasted meats, golden loaves, wheels of cheese, and barrels of ale. Servants carried trays heavy with venison, goose, and pork. Spices, rare treasures from distant lands, seasoned dishes in ways peasants could only imagine. Candles blazed in iron chandeliers, warming the stone walls with their glow. The sound of laughter, clinking goblets, and music filled the air. For peasants, the thought of such a table was almost dreamlike. The contrast of worlds beyond the castle walls. Villages lay silent, smoke rising weakly from their chimneys. Peasants gnawed on bark bread while their lords tore into roasted meat. Children in huts begged for broth, while noble children chased each other across polished floors. The contrast was stark, a cruel reminder that hunger was not shared equally. The feast as power for nobles. Feasting was more than indulgence. It was a display of authority. To host grand meals during famine proved their wealth and strength. It reminded peasants of their place and of the vast divide between those who ruled and those who served. Yet such displays also sowed quiet resentment. Every story of noble feasts spread through villages, deepening anger and despair, charity in small measure. Some nobles, guided by faith or mercy, offered alms. A sack of grain, a loaf of bread, or a meal given at the castle gates softened suffering for a few. But generosity was limited. For many peasants, charity was a drop in the ocean of need. The dream of bread at night, peasants dreamt of feasts, of tables laden with food, of warm bread and endless ale. These dreams, though cruel, were also a comfort. They gave starving minds a taste of abundance, even if only in sleep. Closing of Block 19, the noble's feast was a mirror, reflecting the inequality of medieval life. While peasants starved, nobles dined. Yet even in their hunger, peasants endured, knowing that spring belonged to the soil, and the soil belonged to them. Their survival, though bitter, was more profound than any feast. The famine winter stretched endlessly, its nights long and bitter. Yet even in the coldest darkness, sparks of hope remained. For peasants, survival was not only about food. It was about holding on to the small lights that pushed despair away. The hearth is a beacon. Every cottage had a hearth, no matter how small. Its fire was weak, fueled by scraps of wood or bundles of straw, but its glow was precious. Families gathered close, letting its light fall on weary faces. The hearth was more than warmth. It was a reminder that life still flickered, even when the world outside was frozen. Songs in the silence. In famine winters, songs became a shield. Mothers hummed lullabies to soothe crying children, their voices soft but steady. Men sang old ballads while mending tools, filling the silence with memory. Even when voices cracked with weakness, the melodies carried courage. A song cost nothing, yet it fed the soul. Faith in tomorrow. The darkest nights were endured by clinging to tomorrow. When spring comes, the fields will wake again, parents whispered to their children. The snow will melt, and the earth will remember us. These words, though fragile, were like seeds planted in hungry hearts, promises of life after hunger, shared humanity. Neighbors visited one another, sharing company when food could not be shared. A laugh over a faint memory, a story of summers past. Even silence shared by firelight. All these moments reminded peasants that they were not alone. Togetherness was hope itself. Small miracles. Sometimes, hope came in unexpected gifts. A hen laid an egg in midwinter. A root was found beneath frozen earth. A stranger shared a crust of bread. These moments felt like miracles, blessings strong enough to carry families through another night. Closing of Block 20. The darkest nights did not break the peasants. They revealed their quiet strength. In firelight, in song, in faith, and in community, they found hope. And hope, even more than bread, was what kept them alive until the thaw. After months of endless cold, the first signs of change appeared. The days, once swallowed by darkness, began to stretch a little longer. The sun, pale but steady, climbed higher in the sky, spilling light across frozen fields. For peasants, this return of the sun was not only a change of season, it was salvation. The melting snow that had covered the earth like a heavy shroud began to soften. Drops of water trickled down from roofs, forming rivulets that shimmered in the light. The ground beneath, dark and damp, breathed again. Children ran outside to touch the muddy earth, their hands stained with its promise. Even in hunger, they smiled, for the world no longer seemed lifeless. The thaw of the river's frozen rivers cracked and groaned, ice breaking apart into floating shards. Water rushed free, carrying with it the sound of movement, of renewal. Villagers gathered at riverbanks, listening as though it were music, the melody of life returning. The return of birds. From the forests came birdsong, faint at first, then louder each day. Their voices cut through the silence of famine, reminding peasants that the cycle of nature continued, unbroken. To hear birds in the sky was to hear the voice of spring itself, strength in the soil. With the thaw came work. Peasants dug into the softened earth, planting seeds with trembling hands. Though their bodies were weak, their will was strong. Each seed was more than grain. It was hope buried in soil, a prayer waiting for rain, the smile of the sun. The sun grew warmer with each passing day, its light kissing the fields, the cottages, the faces of those who endured. For peasants, every golden ray was a blessing, a promise that hunger would end, and life would rise from the ground once more. Closing of Block 21. The return of the sun was more than spring. It was the turning of fate, the answer to prayers whispered in the dark. Peasants, though scarred by hunger, lifted their eyes to the light, knowing they had survived the worst. For in the warmth of the sun lay the first true taste of tomorrow. With the sun's return came the call of the soil. Though famine had left bodies frail and spirits weary, peasants knew there was no time to rest. The earth, thawed and waiting, demanded hands, and those hands answered. Weak but determined men and women, thin from hunger, gathered in the fields with simple tools. Their steps were slow, their breath short, but their determination unbroken. Every swing of a hoe, every handful of seed cast into the furrow, was an act of defiance against the hunger that had nearly consumed them. Seeds like prayers, the grains they planted were few, often saved at great cost during the famine months. Each seed was precious, guarded as carefully as gold. When dropped into the soil, it was not just grain, it was a prayer whispered into the earth. Grow, feed us, save us. Children in the fields, even children joined, carrying baskets too heavy for their small arms. They stumbled, laughed, and sometimes cried, but their presence gave strength to their elders. To plant seeds with children beside them was to believe in a future that famine had tried to erase. The bond with the land as peasants pressed seeds into soil. They spoke softly to the earth, as though it could hear. Generations had taught them that the land was alive, that it remembered the struggles of its people. The bond was not one of ownership, but of partnership. The soil gave life, and the peasants gave back with sweat and prayer. The first rain. When the first spring rains fell, peasants lifted their faces to the sky. The drops mingled with the dirt, darkening the soil where seeds lay hidden. To hear rain on the fields was to hear the promise of bread, still unseen but already alive beneath the earth. Closing of Block 22. The planting of seeds was not only the start of the growing season, it was the rebirth of hope. Weak bodies leaned on strong wills, and famine's shadow began to fade. For in every furrow of soil, peasants buried their despair and sowed tomorrow. Weeks passed after the planting. The soil lay quiet under the spring sun, and peasants waited with anxious hearts. Every morning, men and women walked the fields searching for signs. Their eyes scanned the furrows. Their hands brushed the damp earth. Then, one day, the miracle appeared. The first green shoots, a whisper of life. Tiny blades of grass pushed through the soil, fragile yet full of promise. To see green after a winter of gray and white was to see life itself return. Children pointed and laughed, their voices carrying across the fields. Elders knelt and touched the shoots with reverence, as if greeting long-lost friends. Joy in the village news spread quickly. "The fields are waking!" voices cried. Villagers gathered, walking among the fragile sprouts. Hunger still gripped their stomachs, but their hearts felt lighter. For the first time in months, smiles broke across tired faces. The shoots were not bred yet, but they were hope made visible. Songs of gratitude that evening. Cottages glowed with small fires, and songs rose from weary throats. Hymns of thanks were sung, not just to God, but to the earth itself. Bells rang in some villages, marking not a feast, but a promise of one yet to come. Protecting the green, the shoots were tender, vulnerable to weather, pests, and wandering animals. Peasants guarded the fields carefully, placing children as lookouts and building fences from branches. Every plant was defended like treasure, for it was treasure, the treasure of survival, the symbol of renewal. The first green shoots were more than crops. They symbolized resilience. Famine had scarred the people, but the soil had answered their prayers. Life, fragile but unstoppable, had returned. Closing of Block 23A's, the fields turned from brown to green. Peasants felt the weight of famine lifting. Their bodies were still weak, but their spirits grew strong again. For in every blade of green, they saw the proof. The world had not abandoned them. The summer sun ripened the fields, and the first true harvest since the famine winter finally arrived. Where once there had been silence and hunger, now there was color, movement, and joy. Golden fields swayed in the wind, heavy with grain, as though the earth itself rejoiced with the people. The call to the fields at dawn, bells rang and voices called across villages. Families young and old poured into the fields carrying sickles, baskets, and carts. The air was filled with excitement and urgency. This was not just a harvest, it was survival gathered by hand, cutting the grain men and women bent low, slicing through stalks of wheat and barley. Their arms ached, but they welcomed the ache. Children followed, tying bundles and stacking them high. The work was endless, yet no one complained. Each stalk cut was a victory. Each sheaf gathered a step away from hunger. Songs of labor songs rose in the fields, keeping rhythm with the sickles. Voices carried across the golden sea, echoing with laughter and relief. After months of silence and despair, music had returned to the land. The harvest was not only food, it was joy harvested in every note sung. Bread. Once more back in the cottages, women ground grain into flour and baked the first loaves. The smell of bread filled the air, thick and warm.
Families sat together holding crusts in trembling hands. For many, this was the first true meal in months.
Tears mixed with smiles as bread broke between them. Celebration of survival. As the harvest continued, villages celebrated with small feasts. Ale was poured, fires lit, and dances broke out under the stars. Though simple, these moments of celebration carried deep meaning. They had endured, and famine had not destroyed them. Closing of Block 24. The harvest of survival was more than food. It was proof that life, though fragile, could rise again from the soil. Peasants, scarred but unbroken, reclaimed their strength with each sheaf of grain and each loaf of bread. The famine winter was over. The famine winter ended, but its memory remained etched in every life it touched. Villages once filled with hunger now buzzed with harvest and renewal, yet no one forgot the cold months of despair. From those trials came lessons, painful, powerful, and lasting. The fragility of life peasants learned how thin the line was between survival and loss. A failed harvest, a harsh winter, and hunger came swiftly. Life was fragile, dependent not on wealth or power, but on the mercy of weather, soil, and fate. The strength of community, they also learned the power of unity. It was not kings or nobles who saved them, but neighbors who shared scraps of bread, who tended fires together, who watched over one another in the darkest nights. Survival was a collective triumph, woven from kindness as much as labor. The value of the earth famine reminded them that the soil was both master and savior. It could withhold and it could provide. Respect for the land deepened, and each seed planted afterward carried not only hope, but reverence. The shadow of inequality, the memory of nobles feasting while peasants starved, also left its mark. Though voices of rebellion were quieted, resentment lived on. Stories of injustice traveled through generations, planting seeds of change that would grow in centuries to come. Faith that endures in famine. Peasants prayed, sang, and whispered to one another that spring would come. And it did. Faith became not only a spiritual comfort, but a survival tool, a light in endless darkness. The legacy of survival. The famine did not break them. It shaped them. Peasants carried scars, but also wisdom, to cherish abundance, to endure hardship, and to cling to hope even when the world seemed barren. They told their children the stories, not only of hunger, but of resilience, of strength, and of life reborn when all seemed lost. Closing of Block 25, the famine winter was over, but its lessons lived on. Peasants knew that hunger could return, yet they also knew they had faced its shadow and survived. Their story was not only one of suffering, but of triumph. The quiet, uncelebrated triumph of ordinary people who endured the harshest trials and still found hope.